Daniel, I'm really excited to speak to you today. I think a year ago we wouldn't even be in this close proximity given the pandemic that we're in. But that doesn't mean that all concerns need to be left at the door. We are seeing that there is a concern and a rising trend of a third wave of infections of COVID-19, not only globally, but in other emerging markets and on the African continent. What are we seeing in terms of these trends in sub-Saharan Africa?
Thanks for having this conversation with me. It's been awkward. From the beginning of the year, we were under the impression that what we know about the vaccine, at least about COVID, forgive me, would allow us to ramp up vaccinations across the continent. This simply didn't happen. Mm-hmm. In fact, what we found was a few countries in January and February managed to finalize deals with the major manufacturers and start a process of vaccinating. But the bulk of the countries were heavily reliant on receiving vaccines through the COVAX facility. And this in itself had a few delays. So no, we're not doing well in terms of the rate of vaccination as a continent. We do have some bright spots that, like Kenya, that are doing quite well in terms of getting their vaccination rate up. And effectively what we're trying to understand is, are we going to reach some form of herd immunity over the next 12 months? That's really the question. Because then that has a material impact on how we respond as governments towards some form of localized restriction, etc., or how we respond towards either ramping up vaccinations even more, or what we will need to do within the healthcare sector to protect the bulk of our population. So we're in this awkward juncture now where we've started vaccinating, but the figures that are coming out are not looking great across most of our African countries.
So answer that difficult question for us. How far are we from reaching herd immunity, and perhaps remind us as to what herd immunity is and why it's so important?
Well, it's a difficult one specifically for COVID-19. Generally we would talk about herd immunity from a place of a certain population size or a certain percentage of your population that has either been vaccinated or through some form of natural immunity have been able to build up antibodies against a specific pathogen or virus. And so last year, a few reports were released that indicated that potentially, that's the big word here, for COVID-19, we would need to get about 60 to 70% of our populations vaccinated. The problem is, as you're well aware, there's several strains. So, there is a school of thought right now that says, well, look, herd immunity then simply won't work. Basically, we'll need everyone to be vaccinated. But we took the approach of saying, okay, great, given all of this, let's start somewhere, and we'll work on a number of about 65% vaccination, or those who have received natural immunity against the disease. And from that base, then we could start answering that question as to which country would get there. And looking at the daily vaccination rates, Kenya stood out as an economy that could potentially reach herd immunity within the next 12 months, or at best, let's say the second half of next year, 2022. We also saw that in Ghana, they were also vaccinating at a rate which gave us a tad bit more comfort. There were easier markets from a population size, and we spoke about this earlier. Namibia and Botswana, maybe they might be able to reach herd immunity sooner, and we do think that they will if they can actually manage to get the vaccines into their economies, given that they're much smaller economies. But for some of our other countries, it's not looking great, to be quite frank. We're looking at scenarios that at this vaccination rate, it might take them over 5 years before they get to that point.
Now that's time we can't afford though, right?
It's time we can't afford. What complicates matters is, every country took a different strategy. So everyone potentially may have started with vaccinating the medical facility or medical personnel, forgive me, and then maybe moved over to the more vulnerable ones. And so the hope and prayer is that when they move over to the mass sort of population, that then they will be doing several doses. But there's another thing people didn't consider, which is vaccine hesitancy.
Yes. And a large part of the continent has really been having to educate people, right, about the safety of vaccines.
Yeah. there are countries that we know of that have vaccines in storage, but people are simply not getting registered or going for vaccination. And, there could be hordes of risks. It's a big continent, lots of different cultures, so many myths associated with vaccinating. That form of hesitancy has created a problem for a lot of our governments, because then you can't ramp up to the rate in which you'd want to. And look, ideally, you'd want most of these economies to be vaccinating at a rate higher than 100,000 vaccination doses on a daily basis. That's sort of where you would want to target as an economy. But they're simply not doing that. We've seen some countries it's as low as 7,000 doses on a daily basis. And the double whammy is the fact that you need 2 doses in certain instances. For example, with the Kavishe one, it's the AstraZeneca vaccine. So that then creates another layer, because we know from studies that there is some form of immunity received with the first dose, but you really need both of them. And that's why a lot of data out there talks about partial versus full, vaccination, ergo immunity from the disease.
Yeah.
And then just a big stickler is the fact that there's so many strains that we're learning about, and we need to be able to manage that as well.
This raises significant concerns, not only for the livelihoods of the citizens of the African continent, but also when it comes to economic recovery.
Yes.
And we know that the lockdowns and harsher restrictions have had a negative impact on many economies on the continent. So this slow pace of vaccinations, this hesitancy towards vaccinations, and the concerns around herd immunity and multiple strains of the virus, what does that mean for the economic recovery of economies in sub-Saharan Africa?
Look, it's a difficult one to try and quantify. What we know for certain is that this will be a year of some form of recovery. Now, it's not just because we're going from a very low base, massive recession in 2020, 2021, things should do naturally better. But there's been a massive appetite for commodities globally. And we know that a lot of our African economies are exporting this to international markets. Effectively, what this then means is copper exports, as an example, has ramped up. Gold exports have ramped up. We're seeing exports coming out from other minerals, other base metals, iron, zinc, etc. And so we're going to see some economies effectively growing in 2021, but because of a localized industry versus it being across the board. And so you add on COVID-19 and the impact it's having on our consumers, on employment, and it creates, at best, a challenge towards actually reaching some form of economic recovery in just simply 1 year. And our base case, it will take 2 to 3 years for most of our economies to recover to pre-pandemic levels, let alone start growing at a economically sustainable level. So it's a tough one to try and quantify. God knows we try.
Yep.
But we will need to see precisely how the continent does respond to vaccination. We will need to see whether or not our governments institute any additional form of localized restrictions as we go through third wave, which is pretty much baked in right now across most of our markets. So we'll need to look at wave 4. And then that will determine a lot about how our economies then perform in the next few years.
You must assist a lot of your clients across the continent in terms of understanding what to do now. Panicking is not ideal. So what next and where to from here?
A big thing is education. So one of the lead scientists globally was asked this very question, which vaccine should people use? And he was quite honest in saying the one you can get your hands on. Right? And the repercussions around this are there could be hesitancy in one economy versus another with respect to the fact that you can't operate here if we're not showing some form of vaccination. Look, and it's all circumspect, but for someone who still remembers walking around with a yellow fever vaccination certificate, it tells you that how this plays out in the next few years is not clear, but to a great extent, vaccinating is helping to build a form of resilience against COVID-19, and it should be the first point of call. Secondly, because the standards are being updated relatively quickly, because the data is coming in at quite a rapid pace, every single client who's operating cross-border needs to be very well aware of the jurisdictions in which you're operating in view of the pandemic, and maintain the protocols that are there to protect humanity. Look, we effectively are in an environment where now we're learning that this form of vaccination may need to be annual. That's what the science is telling us. We could get to that place. But in this period where we're still not 100% certain, what you can do is err on the side of caution. And I think that's what most businesses should do.
science influencing politics and government policies, and of course playing out in terms of business and the livelihoods of many Africans across the continent. Daniel, we look forward to seeing how this does unfold, but as you say, err on the side of caution and prioritize livelihoods of citizens and of course the success of businesses and institutions, and hopefully we reach those targets before the next 3 to 5 years.